Childcare subsidies coming to an end yesterday are going to put a lot of pressure on Australian families. What's Labor's concerns?
Well, look, it is going to put a lot of pressure that families are now actually paying the fees they were prior to the pandemic. And of course, those levels of fees were very high, and there were many families struggling with affordable childcare before this pandemic. What we know is that we're now in a deep recession. Families are doing it tough, and it is absolutely the wrong time to snap back to the old childcare system that was designed with fee levels designed for quite full employment. And of course, what we know is many families are relying on JobKeeper. They're relying on mortgage moratoriums, a whole range of things to help balance the books during this difficult time. Then to actually now have to find the money for childcare and actually pay it. I think a lot of families will be making the difficult choice to withdraw their children from early education and care.
What the Education Minister has said is that they found in this period that there was significant pressure put onto childcare providers because they were really being oversubscribed by so many families. If there simply aren't the places there, what do you expect the government to do in the meantime?
Well, what the government did is they announced free childcare and didn't fund centres for free childcare. What we had is centres that could only take up to 50% of their capacity during the pandemic because the government was only paying them 50% and they weren't able to take any revenue from anywhere else. So there were many centres that were licensed for more places, but because of the government's funding arrangements, could not take more children on. What I think the government needs to do is recognise that we are not back into pre-pandemic employment. Our economy hasn't recovered. The way the government talks is that demand has gone up because of free childcare, and therefore it's time to snap back to the old system. Well, what we'll see is a lot of children being taken out of early education and care and not being able to access that. And a lot of families trying to balance what is often a bit of work, a bit of family responsibilities, and not being able to balance it all. My biggest concern is as we exit this really difficult time, there'll be families and parents, particularly women, that will say no to work because they can't afford the childcare that goes along with it. And that is really going to hamper our economic recovery.
Would you support targeted support for Victoria in particular, or other states that have to go into those kind of strict lockdowns again, that they get access to special childcare subsidies that other states don't?
Well, look, obviously Victoria has been an example to show that we are clearly not out of the woods yet. There's clearly a lot of difficulties, and what we know is the government is removing JobKeeper from all early education and care, all educators as of next Monday, even those in Melbourne. So there's a real concern, I think, in early education and care in Melbourne and in Victoria as a whole. But I think the problem is much wider than that. It is an economic recovery question. Do we want families, when they are trying to reorientate, when they're trying to look for work, when they're trying to reorganise their business? I've had mums talking about changing their business model desperately in response to this pandemic. They need time to do that, and they need childcare to do that, but they don't have any revenue because they're reorientating their business model. So this is about economic recovery just as much as it is about the crisis of the pandemic, and the government needs to be flexible enough to respond to both.
There's been a lot of discussion around the effectiveness of wearing face masks at this time. It's now recommended in Victoria if you can't keep safe physical distance. Do you think childcare centres should be required to wear face masks when interacting with children, parents, plenty of people who could contract the disease?
Well, look, obviously that is a matter for the health authorities. I don't pretend to be an expert on the health and safety. Of course, it would depend on what the health advice should be. But of course, what I would say is if the health advice is to wear a face mask, whether that is in a childcare centre, whether that's in an aged care centre, then there shouldn't be a shortage. That if that is the directive, then absolutely we need to make sure that those workers get the personal protective equipment. So really I would be guided by the health advice, but what we don't want to see is if that is the health advice, because you can't socially distance, then what we do need is for the government to step up and make sure that personal protective equipment is available for those workers.